Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Gladly. So I want to start with asking you about your opening line that you use often. You say, "I know. I'm surprised. I'm a comedian too."
Yeah.
Um, what is it that you like about that open?
I think it addresses that I don't fit the mold of what a lot of people expect a comedian to look like or sound like, but without having to kind of belabor the point, it kind of addresses it, and then I can move on pretty quickly to what I want to talk about. So it's like a quick hit and move on.
Cool.
Yeah.
And you do a lot of interesting things. I find with your comedy, you, to me, play a bit of a character,
Mm-hmm.
which is a break from the kind of super earnest or like very personal type of comedy that seems to be popular right now.
Sure.
Could you talk about that, about how you found your character and how that came out?
Yeah, I feel like every comedian to some extent is playing like a bit of a heightened version of themselves, but mine is uh it is still pretty close to me, but I think it's just sort of a filter on certain parts of my brain and maybe like a little bit of a quirkier vibe than I am maybe in real life, but I don't think I necessarily started stand up being like, okay, I'm going to be this character. It was just sort of talking out loud and then finding what most interested me to talk about and then honing in on that and sort of cultivating that into its own worldview.
So is the character, is something like the character that you do now what came out first with your comedy?
I think so. I mean, I think it's hard to know when it's your own stuff to be aware of that it comes across as maybe a persona because it's just how my mind works. But I think it is like people always be like, oh, like you have such an, like you do stand up in a kind of a different way than I usually see it. And I think that's just maybe the rhythm that comes to me naturally. So it's maybe my impression of what I think stand up is.
And what made you realize that you wanted to take comedy seriously?
Mm, I mean, I'm a pretty anxious person, so for me it was very like one foot in front of the other. Like I definitely didn't have any goals when I first started, and then it's like as I kept doing it I was like, well, I guess I can say I do comedy. Like I didn't want to get ahead of myself.
And where does that come from, do you think, that sort of approach to comedy?
Mm, I mean, my parents are both like immigrant parents and they're both like workaholics. So I think there was a very high bar of like perfectionism and like working hard in our house. So it's like you can't just slack at something and then say that you're doing it well or doing it at all.
You definitely take your comedies to some really absurd
Yeah,
places.
yeah.
You also break the fourth wall
Hmm.
sometimes. Could you talk about that approach to comedy and what that device does for you?
Yeah, I think for me, just the longer I've done comedy, the more you end up watching it. And I think to me, it's what interests me is kind of the structure of it and the technique of like the audience being part of like kind of the part of the immediate environment of any joke because no matter what their reaction or lack of reaction affects the joke in that set. So I think them kind of being another player in the game always makes me interested in seeing how I can kind of incorporate them without having to maybe address them directly because I'm not like a big crowd work person because I'm pretty shy. So I think it's like a way to use them without having to like directly interact with them.
That's super interesting. And in talking about the range of your comedy, the absurdity,
Hmm.
the big things, the small things, Twitter
Yeah.
is another medium that I think you're amazing
Oh, thanks.
at. Um, I'd love to talk about comedy on Twitter.
Sure.
It's launched careers.
Mm-hmm.
It's also hindered some careers.
That's true.
It strikes me as a medium in and of itself.
Yeah.
Do some of those jokes that I think are absolutely perfect on Twitter, do they translate on stage or are they better in writing?
I think it's definitely a game of trial and error. Like I've tried jokes exactly as they are on Twitter and they don't work, but then if I reformulate them a little bit, they will work. It's just I think it's the difference between reading something in print and then delivering it on stage. It's like they're little ticks and stuff that you have to work around. But I definitely, for me, do use it as like a joke incubator. Like I know sometimes people are like, "Oh no, I don't use my tweets on stage," but I don't know. To me, it's kind of fair game because it's like everything. Creativity is so fluid, so it doesn't feel like where one medium ends, like another begins. It's all the same pool.
Do you have any examples of jokes that just didn't work on stage that were great on Twitter?
Um, I don't know if I can think of one off the top of my head, but like there like certain types of humor on Twitter, like you can do like punctuation jokes and that won't work on stage or like spell something weird and but then, for stand up it's like it's all about delivery and like sort of your attitude towards the subject, which in Twitter can be conveyed more with just like writing in all caps or something. And in stand up, you have to be a little bit more uh, delicate about it.
And on the topic of content and what works where, you've made some great tweets about how the entertainment business treats women and people of color, kind of on the social commentary side. And one I enjoy is I like how sometimes the equivalent of female character development is giving her bangs.
Yeah.
Could you talk about a joke like that and where that fits in your career, where that fits in what you're trying to do with your comedy, but also in terms of the mediums again and what works online and what works live?
Yeah, I think jokes like that, I feel like I'm definitely lucky to be doing comedy at a time when it's not that unusual for like one women to be doing comedy. Like I think it's like kind of an overwrought subject at this point, and also minorities like that are not just black and white but also like across the spectrum. So I think in a lot of ways I'm lucky to have examples before me of people doing comedy really well, like Aziz Ansari and Mindy Kaling, but there's still like so many walls. Like I'll still go to a meeting sometimes and people will be like, oh, well, like what, like why don't you do like more Indian accents in your act, or like why don't you try to fit this pre-constructed mold of what we can do with your type of character? And I think it's always for me, it's been both a good and a bad thing that sometimes people don't know where to place me when they see my act. They're like, you're a little bit too weird, but then you're not weird enough. But I think in that sense, like I like kind of challenging the expectations of what people want to see and meeting them in the middle a little bit. So in that sense, that tweet and that attitude is like, okay, well, I'll try to like, write something that, studio executives want to read, but at the same time I want to retain my authenticity and like integrity as an artist.
And you touched on a lot of things there. One thing you touched on is, I think, a challenge that a lot of people of color in entertainment face, which is how do I come up against these expectations? Do I challenge them? Do I try to work with
Right.
them? And a lot of people shirk that sort of responsibility altogether and say,
Yeah.
I'm just going to kind of do my own thing. But what about the responsibility to expand the conversation around race, period? Do you feel that's a responsibility for you?
I do think it is, but I also think it's in some ways it's important to talk about it, but that it it's important to not also let it dominate the subject. Like I feel like one thing that people of color get shoehorned into is being like racial representatives, and then their whole presence is just like race based. And I think just having faces in the room that are diverse but not having their diversity be the main point of why they're there is as important. Because I worked on this show Totally Biased, and it was like a really diverse writers room, but I definitely felt like I wasn't representing like being an Indian person as much as kind of being a weird introvert in that room. So that to me felt like a kind of progress.
Like another level of progress.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you about another one of your tweets that I found really interesting.
Hmm.
Or actually, not a tweet, a comment to the Huffington Post. You said, show business makes you question if you're a good person or not.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
I think you're always sort of sometimes being given opportunities where you have to decide. You're like, is this worth the opportunity versus like, would I feel like guilt about doing this if I looked back on it in the past? Like, it's either a project you don't really like or like a show that doesn't really fit what you believe in, either because of the overarching themes or it's like slightly misogynistic. So you kind of have to constantly be weighing like, is this something that I should just take the opportunity and be grateful for it, or should I just stand my ground? Because as nice as it is to be like, well, I'm only gonna do things that I feel strongly about, and I'm never gonna betray my morals. Like, there are people who do that and then they sort of fade into obscurity, and it's not that they did the wrong thing. Like, I think that's great that they did the right thing, but it's like, but then can I get a wider platform and then like impose my agenda? So it's like a weird game of strategy.
Do you like that aspect of the entertainment business? Like, do you find that's a challenge that's kind of good for you, maybe on another level, like personally or something like that?
I think it challenges me just as someone who's not a huge risk taker in a lot of ways, but I it's not my favorite. Like, if I didn't have to make those decisions, it would be nice. But I do think in the long term, it makes you a more savvy business person and like makes you either more firmly believe in what you believe in or be like, actually, maybe this battle isn't as important to me as I thought it was.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Kamau Bell's show. You've trained with the Groundlings and Upright Citizens Brigade, very auspicious groups.
Yep.
What's next for you? What would you like to do next?
I think I would like to continue sort of writing for stuff. Like, I finished a pilot script, so I'm kind of looking to maybe try writing for a sitcom or more story-driven show. And then, I mean, I definitely like being in front of the camera too. So I think as a stand-up, you're kind of spoiled in that you get to write and perform regularly. So if I could keep doing those things in some way or shape, I will. And then I'm working on an album for this year. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
me.